If you're on the twin flame journey, you're going through an ego death. So I wanted to speak about the ego today because this is a big part of the journey, the ego death that we go through on the spiritual awakening, and how the ego slows us down through the ascension process. So really getting a handle on the ego and the thoughts that are happening inside of us internally, and what we're aligning with, what we are identifying with, and really how that's eradicating, how that ego death is eradicating the ego, essentially, so that we can come into that space of inner peace and inner union with the self. The ego is what is going to trip you up and what is going to slow you down. And, this is part of the process and it's all fine. But if we can, the faster that you can get that ego on a leash and stop identifying with the thoughts in your mind and stop identifying with the beliefs that the ego is trying to tell you, the easier and the faster that you're going to progress on your ascension path. The ego obviously has its place, has its purpose, but it we can't identify with the ego. Once we're going through the ego death, you come into the awareness that you are not your ego, you are the soul. So when you're identifying with ego and when you are in ego, you are in that separation consciousness. And then once we shift out of that separation consciousness and we shift more into soul, slowly, we keep shifting and shifting on the journey, and we stop identifying with the ego and we start identifying with the soul. That is when the journey can flip on its head for us. So we, ultimately is that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to shift more and more back to the soul and the soul frequency, and listening to that inner intuition and the inner guidance. It's the whispers. The soul is not loud. The soul is the soul whispers to us. The ego is very loud. So if you want to know, is it ego or talking, or is it the inner knowing and the inner compass and the soul that's talking? That's how you can kind of differentiate. The difference is that the ego is very loud, and the ego is very kind of in your face and very fear-based. It's like, what about this and what about that, and da 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 da, like, what if this happens, and what if I do this and that doesn't happen, and what are they doing now, and like, that's ego. That's all ego based, and that's all of that is what is keeping you separate from the self. Once we learn to step back and disidentify with the ego and realize that the ego is not us talking, the ego is simply running its own game, and keeping you in those lower vibrations and keeping you in that fear-based energy all the time. The ego, the ego absolutely loves and thrives on that fear-based energy, and it will keep you looping and looping and looping. So the more that you can shift back into that soul frequency and stop identifying with the thoughts, and all the patterns that are going on within, the easier this path gets. So the goal is to disidentify with those ego-based thoughts and feelings and emotions. A big part of it too is the emotions that we're identifying with. Realize that is not you, that is your ego, and that is what's breaking down on this path. So in order to assist that ascension process and assist that in breaking down and allow the soul frequency to come through and allow those higher vibrations to come through and shift us really back into that soul-based way of living, we need to be the observer of our thoughts. We need to step back and realize that we are soul. We are not the ego talking, and we need to step back and observe the thoughts. We're not judging them. We're not, diving deep into what every little thought has. This is disconnecting from those thoughts, realizing that that's not the true you. That's not who we're identifying with anymore. We're not listening to the fear-based shit that's coming up anymore for us. We're simply observing it, letting it pass through, letting it go, and coming back into that soul frequency in that very neutral state. This can be very assistant and help us through the path, and stop that really obsessive, reeling, out of control thoughts, and all those systems happening, because the more you let it run wild, the more that it will run wild. The more that you identify with it and give it and feed it energy, the more you associate with it, the more energy you give it, the more it will keep running. So any of, Eckhart Tolle's work is phenomenal. When I was going through my awakening, and, it doesn't stop, like you keep ascending after the inner union. But when I was going through that, I was really diving deep into, these spiritual teachers and the work that they've done, and what they teach, because this is a spiritual awakening. This is a spiritual path. So we want to treat it like that. Although you do have this other incarnation of yourself showing you all the parts of you that need to be released and need to be transmuted. That's not to be ignored either. But this is a very spiritual path. So if you can, get sort of a handle on the spiritual aspect of this and what really the ego death is doing, and learn those practices, that will be very assistant for you to move through the path a little bit easier. It's not easy, but a little bit easier if you have the tools to navigate through. So my advice would be, study up on those spiritual practices, help yourself through it. Meditation is great. It brings you back to that still point, brings you back to presence. It's just great for the mind overall. It brings you back to, the present moment. And if you have to do the guided meditations, or you can simply drop down into the meditation yourself, that's great as well. So I hope that helps a little bit in, understanding what the ego is doing here, and what the ego death is doing. So it's bringing us back, shifting us back into that soul frequency, where we are identifying with now that we are the soul, and we are oneness, and we are peace and joy and love and freedom and all that sort of stuff. We are not the ego, we are not the thoughts, and we need to disidentify with those thoughts.